Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the nature of empowerment, first from an existential perspective, but also with respect to my own personal experience of life over these last 60 years. My rationale for doing all of that is twofold. First, it seems to me that the whole issue of empowerment has become something of a hot topic these days. But I find that people rarely understand what empowerment actually is and how it works. And it seems to me that taking an existential approach to those questions would help dispel some of that misunderstanding, especially since seeing empowerment from that perspective can easily prompt us to question a lot of our dubious beliefs about its nature. And that, in turn, can draw us toward actually becoming more empowered in our everyday lives, which of course is the real payoff. Anyhow, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. As usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video along with links to the timestamps. As you can see, I'd like to explore empowerment by articulating what I feel are 7 of its most important principles. So, let's dive right in. The principle number 1. We become powerful, and hence are empowered, when we learn to live authentically. And here I'm taking the idea of authenticity from the philosopher Martin Heidegger, and more specifically from his 1927 work, Being in Time, Sein und Zeit in German. According to Heidegger, authenticity is about what we're moving toward in life. Basically, what possibilities we're on the way to actualizing. And of all of the myriad ways of doing that, there's one rather narrow subset that would qualify as something like our ownmost possibilities, the ones that are most uniquely and most powerfully our own. Basically, what Heidegger is talking about is learning to navigate the terrain of life in terms of something like recognizing and fulfilling a personal destiny, as opposed to doing what we typically do, which is to grind along through our existence by constantly conforming to the dictates of other people's expectations and desires. You know, thinking mostly what they say we should think, having values that they say we should have. Basically, speaking and behaving in ways that the anonymous crowd regards as appropriate. And all of that, I guess, would be fine, and to an extent unavoidable, except for the fact that dancing like a puppet on the strings of other people's desires and expectations is not what empowers us, not in any deep sense at any rate. Instead, we become empowered when we begin to live our own lives, when we learn to think our own thoughts and give voice to truth as it really appears to us, and then begin to actualize those possibilities that would constitute our deeper destiny in this world. Consequently, empowerment means learning to disappoint other people in order to be true to ourselves, which isn't usually an easy or painless process. But then again, when you think about it, hell, what's the alternative? To live out someone else's values, someone else's beliefs and habits? Basically, to live out other people's lives for them? And then to die eventually, unfulfilled and bereft of everything that makes life worthwhile in the first place. Is that really a superior alternative to facing the daunting challenges of authenticity? An alternative that would fill our hearts with ardor and passion and real zest for life? Well, I guess it doesn't quite seem that way to me. Basically, the robotic, obedient life is not the empowered life. So I'd say that the first principle is that empowerment means learning to live authentically. Because as long as we're thoroughly ruled by what other people might think of us, we'll probably never be truly empowered or truly happy for that matter. Of course, learning to live authentically definitely does not mean idiotically ignoring our world's prevailing realities, or indulging in some sort of smug, self-satisfied insularity. In fact, authenticity means engaging the world even more directly and deeply than we would if we were to continue blindly following its dictates. Basically, authenticity means learning to strike a fruitful balance between meeting the world's demands and the demands of our deeper destinies. In other words, the more authentic we are as individuals, the more authentically we are in the world. However, as Heidegger himself indicates, inauthenticity, that is our automatic tendency to conform and obey, is our natural default state. And it consequently takes a special kind of effort to secure even a small degree of authenticity in our lives, along with the kind of empowerment that derives from it. And in case some of you out there are struggling with that challenge, well, you're definitely not alone. In fact, far from it. But let me tell you a little secret that might help. The fact is that no matter what you do and no matter how you live your life, some people will love you for it, and some people will hate you for it, and most people won't give a damn about you either way. So you can drop all of the anxiety about whether other people might hate you because they will, no matter how authentic or inauthentic you are. And you can also drop your anxiety about whether other people will love you too, because that's pretty much inevitable. Okay, so with respect to the second principle of empowerment, I must acknowledge a debt to the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, and more specifically to his treatment of bad faith in his 1943 book, Being in Nothingness. And here it is. We become powerful when we stop making excuses for ourselves and when we let go of the self-defeating habit of blaming other people for our problems. That's because empowerment means learning to assume direct personal responsibility for the quality of our lives. Basically, the exact opposite of excuse-making and finger-pointing. Sure, everyone's life sucks now and then. That's not negativism, that's realism. But contrary to popular opinion, it's not actually the world's job to make us happy or to propitiate us by worshiping slavishly at the temple of our gods, our values, and what we think is right. It's not government's job, it's not our neighbor's job, and it's not society's job either. In fact, when we're full of all sorts of petulant, self-serving complaints, and when we start bellowing about how the world needs to cater to our personal preferences, we're really living in a state of dependency, not empowerment. That's because at that point, the quality of our lives is revolving around whether or not the world is paying attention to all of our belly aching. And in case you haven't noticed it, the thing about the world is, well, it's that it can be a very fickle place. Sure, sometimes the world makes us happy, but it inevitably offers us a fair amount of pain and hardship too. Consequently, expecting the world to change to suit our preferences is a lot like, well, it's basically a lot like going to Vegas. Maybe there'll be a big payoff for us and maybe there won't. But the one thing you can be sure of is that at the end of the day, the house always wins, and the world will stubbornly persist in being the world, whether we like it or not. Consequently, trying to force the world to accommodate our desires is definitely not a reliable road to empowerment in this life. And so the second principle is, empowerment lies in assuming direct personal responsibility for the quality of our lives. Okay, so the third principle of empowerment would probably derive mostly from Henry David Thoreau's book, Walden. And okay, Thoreau is not usually numbered among the existentialists proper, but I'd say that he's definitely a kindred spirit. So the third principle of empowerment is, we're empowered in direct proportion to what we can do without. In other words, contrary to popular opinion, empowerment isn't about getting what we want, but about wanting what we get. The reason is, once again, that life is very fickle and unpredictable about giving us what we want. But more to the point, and contrary to a lot of our prevailing cultural practices, we're not actually empowered when we're perpetually immured within the prison house of our desires, when we spend the largest fraction of our lives chasing the chimera of what we think will make us happy. That's first because happiness of that sort is almost always incredibly fleeting and insubstantial. But beyond that, the larger logic of this world is that life will end up taking us where we need to go, which isn't necessarily where we want to go. And as a consequence, we become powerful when we can easily adapt ourselves to wherever life is taking us, whether it happens to align with our desires or not. When we can respond with equanimity to the good times and the bad, to wealth and to poverty, to privilege and to penury. When we're not overly dependent on X, Y, or Z to make our lives feel worthwhile. And when we're able to adapt ourselves to life that way, it's easy to feel empowered and happy, mostly because life will already feel sufficient, self-explanatory, and complete. So the third principle would be, empowerment is about wanting what we get, rather than getting what we want. It's about learning to play any hand that life happens to deal us with grace and harmony, because it's pretty much inevitable that sometimes life will deal us a lot of strong cards, and sometimes it will deal us lots of weak ones. But real empowerment is about learning to play any hand well. Okay, let's move on to the fourth principle, which would be the deep source of empowerment has to do with improving ourselves, with making ourselves stronger, smarter, wiser, better. Of course, that may be just another way of saying that empowerment is about taking personal responsibility for the quality of our lives. But in any case, it's something that usually doesn't happen when we're blaming other people for our problems. As was the case during the aftermath of the last presidential election here in the United States, pointing fingers and hurling insults at our opponents doesn't do much to make us any stronger or any smarter. And it doesn't do anything to improve our strategies for dealing with the world's exigencies either. It's really nothing more than a childish, self-indulgent distraction from the real source of empowerment, which lies in recognizing our mistakes and shortcomings and then improving ourselves as a consequence, which would be the fourth principle of empowerment. Okay, so on to the fifth principle, which would be no one ever empowers us. Instead, we ourselves claim, or maybe fail to claim, the power that's already ours, already dwelling deep within the hidden recesses of our being. For instance, sometimes in my work as a professor, my students tell me, usually near the end of the semester, that I've empowered them. And as nice as it is to hear something like that, I don't think it's actually true. The truth is that I never give my students any sort of power that wasn't already theirs in the first place. Instead, what I do for them... What do I do for them? Well, I guess it's to make it seem attractive to recognize and then claim their own personal power in their own unique ways. And yeah, they're usually very thankful for that. Probably because no one's ever told them that there's a kind of power residing in their being and that they can reach it if they try. But all of that's very different from empowering them in the sense of bestowing upon them a power they didn't already possess. So the fifth principle would be empowerment is about recognizing and claiming the power that's already ours. In essence, it's about an unusual act of honesty about who and what we really are. Okay, so the sixth principle would be we're empowered when we become free agents in life, and consequently, when we're beholden to no particular orthodoxy or ideology. When we're beyond category, as Duke Ellington once said, and consequently, when we're no longer contained or containable by labels like progressive or conservative or centrist. In other words, contrary to popular opinion, empowerment isn't about conforming to this cause or that one, or this ideological agenda or that one. Instead, we're empowered when we're free enough to range over the wide terrain of life, politically, socially, spiritually, you name it. For instance, that's why when people ask me about my own political affiliations, I usually respond by saying that I'm a free thinker. That means that I sometimes agree with conservatives, and sometimes with progressives, and sometimes with centrists. Moreover, as a free thinker, I feel fine about changing my mind when a perspective seems superior to the one I currently espouse. Consequently, I don't feel particularly inclined to play the whole silly game of pigeonholing myself in one category or another, other than perhaps the most global category of being a reasonably thoughtful and sensitive human being, caught in the winds of transcendence and transformation. You know, just another soul wandering the infinite expanses of time and space that surround us. So, the sixth principle would be, empowerment is about becoming a free thinker and a free agent in life. And that brings us to the seventh and final principle. Empowerment is about recognizing the fundamental paradox of change, which is that things change mostly as a function of what we accept about ourselves and the world, rather than what we resist and deny. That's because change happens mostly when we live through our problems and difficulties, not when we're furiously trying to pretend like they shouldn't exist, usually by refusing to name or recognize them. Basically, at both the personal level as well as at the much larger collective level, censorship, shaming, and repression are not actually good ways of helping us grow, and they're not good ways of empowering us either. That's because empowerment happens mostly as a function of our willingness to face reality and to live through it moment by moment and day by day. And eventually to discover, much to our amazement, that we've somehow reached the other shore and have transformed our lives along the way. In other words, the whole fast food logic of instantaneous change, right now, damn it, is almost always just another case of what transpersonal psychologists sometimes call spiritual bypassing, which has to do with our desperate attempts to promote ourselves to a state of moral and spiritual superiority without being willing to go through all of the hard work it actually takes to get there. For instance, a lot of virtue signaling behavior works that way. But the problem with spiritual bypassing is that it's ultimately just a shallow form of theater and a waste of time and energy, a way of distracting ourselves from the real work of empowerment. Sure, we can change relatively trivial things about our lives that way, much like we change our socks. But changing in our deep heart's core, the place that really matters, well, that's another issue altogether. And at the end of the day, it's probably mostly just our perennial impatience, both with ourselves and with the world more generally, that keeps us from recognizing that reality. Somewhat ironically, I guess, it turns out that our impatience with the process of empowerment is usually the very thing that keeps it from happening. Oops. So the seventh and final principle would be, empowerment is about accepting and living through what's real. In essence, it's about awakening to reality and about learning to live accordingly, rather than giving in to all of our impatient fantasies about how things should be. Okay, so those are a few of my thoughts about empowerment, subject as always to change, possibly later today. After all, empowerment is about being a free agent, which means being free enough to change our minds about things. Anyhow, I hope that this video has invited a few of you to lay claim to your own personal power in one way or another. Perhaps more deeply or more expansively than you already have. That would definitely make me happy. But in any case, thanks as always for listening and for watching. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.